20. I'm 20. The woman who visited every harvest knew why my father never called me daughter. For the first 20 years of my life, I believed my father was simply a quiet man. That was the explanation I carried. That was the story I told myself every time he walked past me without stopping. Every time he answered a question I asked with a single word. Every time he sat at the head of the supper table and spoke to my brothers by name. Eli, pass the bread. Jonas, how did the corn look this morning? And looked through me as though I were a gap in the air where a person might have stood. Told myself he was quiet, that some men were made that way, that his silence was not personal, the way a cold morning is not personal. Simply was. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about most of it. My name is Sarah. I grew up in a close community in Lancaster County, the kind of place where the roads are unpaved past the second mile, and the nearest town feels like a different world entirely. We were old order, which meant the rules were old too. Older than my grandfather, older than his. Rules about dress and speech and work and the order of things. Rules about who sat where and who spoke first and what questions a young woman was permitted to ask and which ones she was expected to swallow. I am 20 years old as I tell you this, and the truth I am describing is only a few months behind me. I have had enough time to stop shaking. I have not had enough time to stop thinking about it, but I have decided to speak, because carrying it alone is beginning to feel like a second kind of silence, and I have already given enough of my life to silence. The woman came every harvest. That was the first fact I remember, though I did not understand it as a fact until I was much older. When I was very small, perhaps 5 or 6, I simply knew her as the woman who helped with the beans. That was how my mother introduced her. She helps with the beans. Her name was Miriam. She was somewhere between my mother's age and my grandmother's, with hands that moved through the bean rows faster than anyone I had ever watched, and gray eyes that reminded me of the sky just before a heavy rain. She never stayed for supper. She came in the morning, worked through midday, accepted a wrapped bundle of food from my mother, always wrapped, never offered on a plate, and left before my father returned from the far field. I noticed that last part even as a child, not with suspicion. Just with the mild curiosity a child applies to the patterns of adults. She always left before he came back. I asked my mother about it once. I was 7, maybe 8. We were shelling the last of the beans inside, and I asked why Miriam never stayed to eat with us. My mother's hands did not stop moving. She has her own home to return to, she said. Does she have children? I asked. There was a pause then, short enough that I almost missed it. She has what God gave her, my mother said. And the subject was closed in the way that subjects in our household were always closed. Not with a door slamming, but with a door simply ceasing to be there. I accepted that. Children accept the architecture of their world because they have no other world to compare it to. I grew up accepting a great many things. I accepted that my father called my brothers by their names and called me the girl or sometimes her when speaking to my mother in the same room. I accepted that when the church photograph was taken the year I turned 9, he placed his hand on Eli's shoulder and on Jonas's shoulder and stood with a careful half-step of distance from me, as though proximity required something he had decided not to give. I accepted that when I graduated from our community school and the bishop congratulated each of us in the front room of the Zook family's house, my father shook hands with Eli and said my son did well, and when it was my turn he looked at the bishop and said only she is finished now, not my daughter, not Sarah, just she. I told myself he was a quiet man. I told myself that was simply how he was. That was my first belief, and for a long time I held it the way I held everything in that house, carefully, with both hands, and without examining the weight of it too closely. The first crack appeared when I was 14. It was the 3rd day of the harvest that year. Miriam had arrived as she always did, before the dew was fully off the grass, with her gray dress and her fast hands, and I was working beside her in the rows when she said something she had never said to me before. She had been watching me for a few minutes, I realized later, watching the way I moved, watching my hands. You have your grandmother's way with the stems, she said quietly. I looked up. My grandmother? She kept her eyes on the row. She never broke a bean she didn't mean to. I waited for her to say more, she did not. But the strange thing, the thing that sat with me for days after, was that she had not said your mother's mother. She had not said any name. She had said your grandmother as though there were only one, as though she had access to a fact I did not. Both of my grandmothers were women I knew. I knew their faces and their kitchens, and the specific way each of them said grace. Neither of them had Miriam's gray eyes. Neither of them had any connection I could identify to this woman, who arrived every harvest and left before my father came home. I mentioned it to my mother that night. I said that Miriam had said something strange about a grandmother. My mother was at the stove. She turned to look at me in a way she almost never did. A full turn, not the half turn she usually gave when I spoke to her. Her expression was not angry. It was the expression of a woman calculating something. "Miriam is kind," she said. "She doesn't always choose her words with care." That was all, but she turned back to the stove with the posture of someone who had narrowly avoided stepping on something hidden in the dark. I was 14, I filed it away. Here is what I understood at 14. I understood that I was different from my brothers in ways that went beyond the ordinary differences between boys and girls in our community. Eli and Jonas were taught, included, consulted. When my father made a decision about the farm, he would speak to both of them. Even when Jonas was still too young to contribute anything useful, he never spoke to me about the farm. When I offered once to help with the haying, genuinely offered, because I was strong and the season was behind, he looked at me the way you look at a word in a language you do not speak, as though you understand that it has a meaning but cannot access it. I understood that my mother watched the distance between my father and me with a particular kind of attention. Not surprise, not confusion, attention. The way you watch something you have agreed to monitor. I understood that Miriam came every harvest and that her arrival was managed carefully, like weather that must be accommodated without being acknowledged. What I did not yet understand was why. I built an explanation. Children and young people always do, when the truth is withheld long enough. I decided that my father had wanted sons, and I had been a disappointment from the beginning. I had heard of such things. The men in our community who measured the worth of a child against the work a child could do, and girls, in their estimation, could not do the work that mattered. I told myself that was the reason. That his silence was not about me personally, not about Sarah, but about the category I represented. That explanation was almost comforting. It made the wound general rather than specific. It made it about a type rather than a person. I held that revised belief for 4 years. The second crack came when I was 18. My grandmother, my mother's mother, fell ill that winter and passed before the first thaw. At the funeral, there was the gathering at our house afterward, the long tables of food, and the low voices of people who had known her for decades. I was moving through the room with a pitcher of water, when I heard 2 of the older women speaking near the window. I was not trying to listen. I simply passed too close at the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one. One of the women said a name I did not recognize, a woman's name. And then she said, very quietly, the child she had with Levi before he married Ruth, and the other woman said, "Hush," and glanced toward the room. I kept walking, my hand was steady on the pitcher. I served the water at the next table and the next, and I smiled when smiled at. And I gave no sign that those words had entered me like something cold and permanent. Levi was my father's name, Ruth was my mother's name. That night I lay in the dark for a very long time. I did not sleep. I was reconstructing something. I did not yet know exactly what. With the few pieces available to me, a child Levi had before he married Ruth, Miriam, who came every harvest with her gray eyes and her fast hands, Miriam, who always left before my father came home. Miriam, who had said your grandmother with the confidence of someone who knew exactly which grandmother she meant. I thought about my father's face, the specific quality of his silence around me, compared to the ordinary quiet of a man who simply preferred few words. There was a difference, I realized. I could feel it now that I was looking directly at it. His silence with my brothers was the silence of comfort. His silence with me was the silence of effort, of a man working to maintain a particular distance, of a man who had decided something and was every day enforcing that decision. I began to understand, not fully, not yet, but the shape of it was forming. If Miriam had a child with my father before my parents' marriage, a child who would now be close to my age, then the question was not who that child was. The question was where that child had gone, and the more I thought about it, the more one answer kept rising to the surface. Not who that child was, whether that child was me. I told no one. There was no one to tell. My brothers would not have understood and could not have helped. My mother, I could not yet think about my mother's role in this, could not yet hold the possibility that she had known, had always known, and had made a decision about what I was permitted to understand about my own life. I was not ready for that. I waited. I had become very good at waiting. The following harvest, I watched Miriam the way I had never allowed myself to watch her before. I watched her hands and her eyes and the angle of her jaw. I watched the way she moved through the rows and the way she accepted the wrapped bundle from my mother and the way. And this was the part I had never truly looked at, the way she looked at me. She looked at me the way you look at something that belongs to you that you have agreed not to claim. It was there in every glance. Not longing. Exactly. Not grief. Something more disciplined than either. Something that had been practiced for 20 years until it looked like simple kindness. On the last morning of that harvest, when my mother had gone inside and we were alone in the row, I said her name. Just her name, Miriam. She looked up. "Am I your daughter?" I asked. She was still for a long moment. The bean row stretched ahead of us in the late morning light, and somewhere behind the barn a cow was moving, and there was wind coming across the upper field, and all of it felt very distant and very clear at the same time. "That question," she said, "belongs to your father. He won't answer it," I said. She looked at her hands. "No," she said quietly, "he won't." She left early that day, before even the midday meal. My mother stood at the window and watched her go without a word. That evening I went to my father. He was in the barn, checking the equipment for the end of season, the work he did every year on the last night of the harvest, alone and unhurried. I stood in the doorway and I waited until he looked at me. He was not surprised. I think on some level, he had been waiting for this moment for 20 years. People who carry a secret long enough begin to feel the weight shifting when the end approaches. "I want to know the truth," I said. "I want you to tell me. Not tomorrow and not through someone else now." He put down the tool he was holding. He sat on the edge of the workbench and looked at the floor of the barn for a long time. Then he told me. His voice was flat and tired. The voice of a man reciting something he has rehearsed in his own mind many thousands of times and never once aloud. Miriam had been his promised companion before my mother. They were young, barely older than I am now, and the community had approved the match and the date was set. She was already carrying his child when the bishop intervened. There had been a discovery about Miriam's family, a relative who had left the community without reconciliation. Stain the bishop considered too great for the family Levi came from. The match was dissolved. The bishop personally directed the arrangement between my father and my mother, who was from a family of standing, unblemished in the community's record. Miriam would not leave the area. She had family of her own there. Roots that went deeper than a bishop's instruction. They made an arrangement, my father, my mother, and Miriam, in a room together before the wedding, with the bishop's knowledge, if not his blessing. Miriam would continue the pregnancy. She would not raise the child. The child would be given to the new household as though born within it. In exchange, Miriam would be permitted to visit, once a year. During the harvest, when the extra hands were a practical justification, when her presence could be explained by the beans, my mother had agreed to this. She had been 20 years old and frightened of a bishop's disapproval, and in love with a man who came to her carrying a complicated history she had decided to absorb. She had raised me, she had fed me and tended to me and taught me every practical thing I know, but she had agreed, in that pre-wedding room, that the arrangement would remain unnamed, that Miriam's visits would have no explanation given to me, that I would be raised in the household without being told where I had come from, that the word daughter, as it applied to Miriam, would never be spoken, and my father had looked at me every day of my life and seen the evidence of a choice that had been taken from him, and a truth that had been carefully papered over. He had not been cruel to me. He had not beaten me or diminished me in ways the community would have noticed. He had simply decided, or been directed, or been too afraid to decide otherwise, that the word daughter would cost more than he was prepared to pay. I stood in the doorway of that barn and I listened to all of it and I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. There was something in me that had been bracing for this specific wait for 2 years, and when it finally landed, I found that I had already built the strength to hold it upright. I asked him one question. I asked him if Miriam knew that I knew nothing. He said she knew. He said it had been the condition she struggled with most, across all 20 harvests, that she had asked him, more than once, whether the time had come to tell me. He had always said no. I left the barn without responding to that. I did not know yet what I wanted to say, and I have learned in the community where I grew up that words spoken before they are ready do damage that takes years to undo. I found Miriam the following morning at the edge of the road, preparing to leave. I do not know if my father had told her, or if she could simply see it in my face. She looked at me and she did not look away. You have her eyes, I said. The grandmother you mentioned. When I was 14, I know, she said. Your great-grandmother, my grandmother too, I nodded. We stood there in the early light, two people on the same road who had been kept a careful distance apart for 20 years, by a combination of fear and pride and institutional authority that had dressed itself in the language of order and peace. I did not embrace her. I was not ready for that. I am still not entirely ready. If I am honest, there is a difference between understanding the shape of a loss and knowing what to do with it, but I said her name. I said Miriam. And then I said, I would like to come and visit, if that is acceptable to you. Her face did not collapse the way I expected. It went very still and very full at the same time, the way a room looks when light comes under a door that has been closed a long time. Yes, she said, it is acceptable. I have visited her twice since then. We sit at her table and we drink tea and we talk about small things, the weather, the garden, the price of feed. We are learning how to be in the same room together without the architecture of the secret holding us in our assigned positions. It is slow, it is sometimes very uncomfortable, but it is real. And I have decided I prefer real discomfort to a comfortable arrangement built on something that was never true. My father and I have not spoken again about what he told me in the barn. I see him at the table, and I see him in the yard, and he looks at me now with something different in his face. Not warmth exactly, something more like relief, and underneath the relief, something that might be shame, though men like him seldom name it. He still does not call me by my name when he speaks to my brothers. Old habits in our community are stitched in more tightly than clothing, but last week, he stopped at the edge of the garden where I was working and stood there for a moment, and when I looked up, he said, very quietly, "Tomatoes are doing well." He said it to me, not past me, not through me. It was a small thing. In another laugh, it would mean almost nothing. In mine, it was the first time in 20 years of harvests that he had offered me something that was not silence, and I accepted it the way you accept the first warm day after a very long winter, carefully without demanding that it be more than it is, and grateful simply that it came. Miriam gave me something before I left her house the second time I visited. A small piece of a quilt, just one square unfinished at the edges, in a fabric I did not recognize. She told me her own mother had cut it from a dress years ago, meaning to finish the quilt before the wedding. The wedding that was dissolved by the bishop's instruction. The quilt was never completed. She had kept that one square for 20 years. I have it now, folded inside the small cedar box I keep beneath my bed. I take it out sometimes in the evenings when the house is quiet and everyone has gone to sleep. I hold it and I think about what it means to be a person who was told, by the silence of everyone around her, that the truth about her own life was too complicated to be trusted to her. I do not think that anymore. I think the truth was always mine. They only held it longer than they should have, and now, at 20 years old, at the beginning of a life I am only just learning to call my own, I have it back.